We'd love to give, but we want to make sure it goes to the right place. If you work in school fundraising, you've probably heard some version of that sentence. It always arrives wrapped in good intentions because the donor genuinely means it kindly. They want their gift to matter, and they want to see where it lands. That response to major gift requests has a way of becoming an accountability check. A donor offers the school $1 million with a list of conditions attached. The board chair stands up at the next meeting and announces it to applause while somewhere in the back row the CFO is running the numbers on what this gift will cost to administer over the next 20 years. For everyone in that room, the moment usually feels good. The gratitude is real, and the relief is even more real because good news at the top of a budget conversation, let's be honest, it's been scarce lately. Most of the room leans all the way into it, and for a few minutes, nobody is doing the math. What the applause obscures is simpler and harder. The building you're standing in already needs that $1 million, and several more like it, just to sustain its current operations, because the financial model the institution was built on has been cracking under its own weight for years. The donor's polite condition is one small symptom of why. I'm John D'Adamo, and this is The School Doctor, a podcast where we diagnose the health of K-12 education and prescribe solutions so it can grow and thrive. Today, we're examining how the traditional independent and private school pays for itself, the strain that economic model is under, and the smaller competitors who are pulling families away from it faster than most heads of school realize. Let's make our rounds. In ecology, there's a concept called carrying capacity. It refers to the maximum population a given environment or niche can sustain over the long term, given the resources available and the constraints of the territory itself. When a species exceeds the carrying capacity of its environment, the population doesn't simply plateau gracefully. It crashes, sometimes slowly and sometimes catastrophically, until the system finds a new equilibrium it can support. A traditional independent school is a beautiful organism. It runs on small classes and deep relationships, with a mission-driven culture maintained by a faculty who could definitely earn more elsewhere, and they choose this work anyway. Various private schools all sit within the same family with different missions and different cost structures, but a very similar heart. These schools have been carrying their communities for generations, and a lot of us, myself included, owe much of who we are to those classrooms. That affection is well earned, which makes the next part harder to say. The carrying capacity of the private sector of the education market has been shifting in ways the institutions haven't fully reckoned with. The way these schools have paid their bills for the last 40 years, it's starting to look like an organism that hasn't adapted to its environment quickly enough. The strain tends to show up first as a particular pattern inside the building. A school can see what needs to change and often sees exactly how to change it. Then the budget says no, and the question gets tabled into the next strategic planning cycle and maybe the one after that. Now, none of this means that the traditional model is dead. The patient's vitals are concerning enough that the cardiologist would like a serious conversation about your lifestyle, but some patients change their habits when they hear that, and others don't. The diagnosis turns out to be the same in either direction. Financial pressures on a traditional independent or private school don't always cluster in the same place. Development directors might be the first to feel donor fatigue setting in, while CFOs may be running projections that they haven't shared yet with the board, and a head of school is often weighing both alongside what the families looking at next year's tuition letter are willing to pay. Those overlapping vantage points are all reading fragments of a single integrated condition. The cleanest way to surface it is to walk through the symptoms one at a time. First, restricted gifts can actually limit school flexibility, and they can create unplanned burdens. A restricted gift is a donation that comes with conditions attached. The money has to underwrite a named scholarship or pay for a specific building that will carry the family's name, and the school agrees to honor that designation or specification as a condition of accepting the check. Schools accept restricted gifts gratefully because the alternative is no gift, and because the donor is usually well-intentioned and trying to help. Restricted gifts also produce a strange institutional pattern over time. The school accumulates a portfolio of obligations to programs or facilities that may or may not still serve the mission or the original intent. Alongside a shrinking pool of unrestricted dollars, the head of school can deploy against current strategic priorities. I've sat in plenty of board meetings where the development update sounds great on the surface and looks much worse when you read the fine print. Yes, we raised $3 million. About 2.5 of it is restricted to programs we're already running. 2 donor-named scholarships have eligibility criteria so narrow we can barely find recipients. 1 capital line item commits us to a building project that the strategic plan never called for. And then the unrestricted portion, which is the part the school can use to respond to whatever shows up next, is a much smaller number. And that smaller number is what keeps the lights on and the salaries competitive. Why do donors restrict their giving in the first place? Often for reasons that are entirely rational from where they sit. A donor has watched institutions before. Maybe they gave unrestricted money to a college once and they never saw evidence that it changed anything. A different donor has the opposite fear. Having watched a school's priorities swing hard one direction or another with each new head, they want their gift anchored to something specific, so a future administration cannot redirect it. Restriction is a control mechanism, and for a donor who is not certain that the institution shares their judgment in all cases, control is a reasonable thing to want. Watch what that reasonable instinct does at a scale, however. The freedom to spend unrestricted money is something a school earns slowly, by handling discretion well over years and having something to show for it. In the healthy version, a board hands the head of school a fund it can spend freely, and the head puts it toward the unglamorous things that keeps an institution sound. A few years later, there's a track record a donor can point to. A school where nearly every gift arrives restricted isn't something close to a catch-22. Donors will not trust it with unrestricted money until it is shown that it can spend unrestricted money well. And it can't show that without the gifts that it hasn't earned yet. The restrictions seal the entrance that actually would satisfy that outcome effectively. Run that pattern for 30 or 40 years, and the arithmetic gets really strange. A head of school can inherit an endowment that looks healthy on the audited statement and is, in practice, almost fully spoken for. Much of the money is committed to scholarships a donor might have designed for a kind of student that the school no longer enrolls, or a program that the board prioritized several strategic plans ago, or a building fund for a wing that no longer fits the method in which the school teaches. Current leadership ends up administering the preferences of donors who are in many cases no longer around or active in the community, sometimes not even living, for a community that doesn't exist in the form that those donors originally imagined at the time of the gift. A school in that position is technically wealthy and functionally constrained. Almost none of the people who built the constraint are still in the room to be able to revisit it. That pattern would be uncomfortable enough on its own. The harder truth to acknowledge is that the restricted gift conversation is a side effect of a much bigger structural problem. Second, the tuition model is doing a job it was never designed to do. NAIS data is really unforgiving on this point. Tuition at independent schools has risen well above inflation for 2 decades. Discount rates have climbed in lockstep because every tuition increase prices out another cohort of families, and then the school responds by deepening financial aid in order to maintain enrollment. The Vanderbilt and SIS sustainability study found that for half of small independent schools, net tuition revenue covers more than 80% of operating income, which means the school is running on a single revenue stream with very little structural cushion when enrollment wobbles. Now layer in demographic realities. Birth in the United States has declined 16% between 2007 and 2024. Projections from the National Center for Education Statistics show a 13% decline in private school enrollment between 2024 and 2031. The pool of school-aged children is shrinking, and competition for that smaller pool is intensifying. Heads of school that I talk to describe a recurring annual conversation that goes something like this. We need to raise tuition 4 to 6% to cover salary increases and facility costs. Every increase pushes more families into financial aid eligibility, which means we have to raise more money in the annual fund to cover the aid budget. The annual fund relies on a donor base that gets narrower every year because the families on aid can't give at the level the full pay family is used to. Next year we raise tuition again, and the cycle compounds on itself. Practitioners sometimes call this the tuition death spiral. Schools at the wealthy end of the market can absorb it for a long time because their endowments are doing the heavy lifting. Run the same dynamic at a school in the middle or lower end of the market, the thin or non-existent endowment, and the room to maneuver disappears fast. The Vanderbilt study put it bluntly. Small schools that leveraged auxiliary revenue or alternative financial models reported a stronger sense of sustainability than schools that stayed the course. Staying the course has become a riskier strategy. You become the dog in that meme where the room is on fire, but he keeps saying to himself, "This is fine, this is fine." Third, the development office is fishing in a thinner pond than people realize. Donor retention data from the Fundraising Effectiveness Project tells the story very plainly. In 2024, only 13.8% of new donors gave again the following year, which is among the lowest retention rates in the history of that report. Donor fatigue shows up clearly in the data, and it hits modest-level givers hardest, which happens to be the pipeline schools rely on to develop future major donors. Meanwhile, the giving environment has been transforming around us, mostly without schools updating their playbook to match. Donor-advised funds now hold over $250 billion in committed philanthropic capital. Monthly recurring giving accounts for somewhere between a quarter and a third of all online charitable revenue, depending on the size of the organization. Collective giving circles have distributed over $3 billion through nearly 4,000 active circles, serving 370,000 members. None of those vehicles look like the annual fund letter you got in September. Most independent school development offices are still running a fundraising cycle designed for 1995, while their donors have moved on to instruments designed for the current decade and century. Donors aren't tired of giving in any general sense. The data is very clear that they're giving generously to other things, but they're tired of giving to institutions whose annual ask hasn't meaningfully changed in 20 years, and whose impact reporting still arrives as a glossy magazine in May, while the rest of their charitable lives have moved on into recurring digital giving and donor-advised fund recommendations. I mean, honestly, how much did that glossy magazine cost the advancement office? Fourth, a different model is now competing in earnest for the same families. Microschools have grown dramatically since the pandemic, and that growth is what turns the picture from a slow institutional grind into something much more disruptive. Estimates of the sector's size vary because no regulatory body tracks it cleanly, but counts run from a documented directory of more than 1,400 schools up through enrollment estimates of 750,000 to more than 2 million students, depending on how loosely the term is drawn. Meanwhile, the sector was close to invisible a decade ago. NAIS published a research advisory in February 2026, putting the average operating expense at a small independent day school at just over $45,000 per student, with a median around $34,000. At a typical micro school, the comparable figure was roughly $8,100 on average and $6,500 median. That is something close to a 5-to-1 gap on what it costs to educate a child. That same NIS advisory is worth reading closely because in part of how it handles its own findings. The briefing analyzes microschools through the NIS Jobs to be Done framework. I drew on this in our last episode. This lens that asks what a family is really hiring a school to accomplish. And it concedes that most microschools satisfy at least 3 out of the 4 jobs. It lays out the cost gap honestly and then it reassures independent schools that they should, in its words, simply be who they are. There's wisdom in not panicking and not abandoning a mission to chase a competitor. The trouble is that the advice answers a marketing question when the data describes a structural one. A school can tell its story more clearly and still charge 5 times what the family down the street pays for the alternative. Being who you are does not change the arithmetic, and in the current economy, the arithmetic is what a family with a choice is looking at. A fair reading of the advisory's own numbers complicates the threat in one important way. Microschools today mostly serve a different population than independent schools serve. On average, they enroll families at or below the local median income, students who may have switched out of public schools or homeschooling, students who are neurodivergent or were falling behind in some fashion. Only about 9% of microschool students come from private schools. Microschools are not, for the most part, pulling current families out of independent school classrooms this year. The pressure is slower and much more structural than that. It works through price expectations, through what a state ESA will and will not cover, and through a generation of parents learning that a very different cost structure is possible. The policy environment is moving in the same direction. As of late 2025, 30 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico had some form of private school choice program, and a federal school choice tax credit is scheduled to take effect in 2027. Education savings accounts are the piece of this that bites hardest for the comparison at hand. An ESA will often cover most of a microschool's tuition, while covering only a fraction of an independent school's. From the family's perspective, the same public dollar goes much further at the cheaper school, and that math is becoming legible to more families every year. Now, layer AI on top of that calculation. A small operator with a thoughtful AI integration can offer a level of personalized instruction and adaptive practice that used to require a much larger staff. Labor costs, which have been the single biggest driver of tuition inflation, are starting to bend in places where small operators are willing to redesign around the new tools. Whether AI-driven personalization delivers the learning outcomes it promises is still a very open empirical question worth taking seriously, but the economics around this are very real, measurable, and immediately present. And what a school spends to operate is what determines what families can afford. Independent and private schools are no longer competing only with each other. They are competing with a model whose cost to educate a child is a fifth of theirs, in a policy environment that increasingly subsidizes the cheaper option. The entire education ecosystem has changed, and the traditional school has not yet changed with it. Traditional independent and private schools sit in a very challenging position right now. Enrollment numbers and annual fund totals look basically fine on a casual reading of the operating budget, but if you read even a little bit more closely, the way the school is funded shows every warning sign of an organism that's exceeded the carrying capacity of its niche. Donor fatigue and the restricted giving loop are one presentation of the underlying condition. Tuition spirals are another. Competitive pressure from microschools and AI-driven cost compression is the third and the most recent. All of them point to the same problem, which is a funding model that depends on a single revenue stream collected from a shrinking pool of families, supplemented by a fundraising operation built for a generation of donors who have largely moved their giving elsewhere, all while delivering an experience whose cost has become often indefensible relative to the alternatives now reaching the market. The diagnosis here is incomplete without a picture of the healthier alternative. A school operating in a sustainable equilibrium draws on several revenue streams rather than one. Tuition is part of it, and so is philanthropy, but so are auxiliary income, partnerships, an endowment draw where the endowment actually supports it, and in some cases, revenue from the school's own programs. Donor relationships rest on impact reporting and trust, not on annual transactional asks repeated identically year after year. In a school built for financial sustainability, tuition is set with a clear-eyed understanding of what the specific community can afford and what value the school is delivering for that price. Leadership at every level of a healthy school knows the carrying capacity of its market and is honest with itself about whether the school is operating within it. Schools in trouble share a different set of characteristics. Conversations about sustainability happen in private and in fragments, never quite making it onto the meeting agenda where they could be addressed out in the open. Boards hear good news at meetings and read the bad news in the audit report several months later. A strategic plan full of educational ambitions sits silent on how the school will pay for them 5 years out. Meanwhile, the development office runs the same playbook it ran in 2010, hoping that doing it at a louder volume or with a bigger gala will produce different results. 5 practical moves are worth considering, each of them within reach of any head of school working in concert with a willing board chair. Any one of them could be started this week. First, name the unrestricted gap out loud. Go through the last 3 years of giving and pull out the truly unrestricted dollars, meaning the ones that the school could spend on any priority the leadership identified. Compare that number to the operating budget. The gap between unrestricted giving and operational flexibility is your trust deficit, expressed as a dollar figure. Showing that number to your board in those terms changes the conversation. The board stops asking how to raise more and starts asking why donors are restricting at the rate that they are. The gift acceptance policy with actual teeth is a useful follow-on move. Having such a policy doesn't mean turning down gifts as a default posture, but it means having a clear institutional framework for evaluating restricted gifts against mission alignment and the cost of administration, and being willing to negotiate terms or, on rare occasions, decline. Saying no to a gift that isn't aligned with your mission is one of the most institution-affirming things a school can do, and yet it almost never happens. Second, build infrastructure for the giving vehicles that donors have moved to. Monthly recurring giving, donor-advised fund grants, giving circles, planned giving, and bequests are all ways to diversify revenue. Pick one to develop seriously over the next 12 months. For most schools, monthly recurring is the easiest place to start because it converts a Gen X or Gen Z donor who would never write a 4-figure check into a $25 a month sustainer who over a decade becomes one of the school's most loyal supporters. One specific example makes the case concrete. An alum who graduated 5 years ago, working their first real job, will not respond to a major gift ask. But they might respond well to an email that says, "We're building a community of monthly sustainers, and a $20 gift connects you back to the school." 10 years on, that same person has reached mid-career with the giving habit already established, and the monthly gift can grow as their income does. The annual fund letter rarely builds that relationship, but a monthly giving program might. Third, model the tuition conversation honestly with your board. Before the next tuition discussion, build a 5-year projection that compares the school's finances under several different assumptions. Start with the trajectory the school has been on, where tuition rises at the historical rate. Then run a second projection in which increases are capped at general inflation, and a third in which tuition stays flat for 2 years while the school works on cost discipline. For each, model out the discount rate and net tuition revenue under different enrollment outcomes. Then, layer in what happens if your local ESA expands to cover most private tuition, or if your demographic baseline drops in line with the NCES projections. Most boards have never seen those numbers laid out clearly. The first time they see it, the conversation about tuition strategy changes substantially. Decisions that felt obvious become much harder to defend, and decisions that previously felt risky start to look like the only genuine path forward. Fourth, take the alternative model seriously as a competitor. A diocesan superintendent or independent school head who hasn't visited a microschool in their region is operating without a complete picture of their competitive environment. Many microschools are now pursuing traditional hallmarks of good standing, including the next generation accreditation protocol from the Middle States Association of Colleges and Schools. The right move for a curious school leader is to go visit one of these schools. I've done it myself recently on several occasions. Talk to the founder, look closely at their cost structure and their staffing model, and pay attention to how they're using AI in instruction and how they're approaching assessment. Don't visit to debunk the model, visit to understand it. You might come away convinced that your school's value proposition is genuinely different and that you're competing in a separate niche after all. The visit might also leave you unsettled, having watched a microschool do things that you should be doing for a fraction of what you spend. Either conclusion is more useful than the current default, which is to assume microschools are a passing fad that won't affect enrollment. The data does not support that assumption, and the runway is shorter than most people are pretending. Finally, have the courageous conversations at the board level. Every school I've worked with that did change its financial trajectory has had a version of the same difficult conversation. The board asked the head of school, if nothing changes for the next 10 years, where does the school end up? The complete answer is rarely flattering, and critical self-reflection is what makes the strategic conversation possible. Now, if the answer shows strong numbers, the school is probably fine. But instead, if the answer involves slowly compromising the mission to maintain enrollment, drawing too heavily on the endowment to cover operations, or losing the families you most want to serve because of price, then the school has a strategic question that no amount of additional fundraising will answer on its own. That question deserves the board's full attention before the audit report forces it onto the agenda. One thing for you in the week ahead. Pull up your school's most recent annual report or its most recent IRS Form 990. Look at the revenue side of the operating budget. Tuition will dominate, and calculate its share of total operating revenue. Philanthropy across annual fund and capital is usually the next largest line. Calculate its share too. Anything not covered by those two categories is your structural diversification, and the size of that remainder tells you a lot about how much room the school has when either of the first two lines wobbles. If tuition and philanthropy together make up more than 90% of operating revenue, your school is running on a very thin base. And the strategic conversation that follows from that fact is one your leadership team should be having out loud, not in fragments. The number doesn't tell you what to do. It just tells you what kind of conversation you should be having and how soon. Okay, so our hypothetical donor is still standing in that lobby with the conditioned $1 million. The board chair is still announcing the gift to thunderous applause. Nothing about that scene has changed, and nothing needs to immediately change about it. Donors give for their own reasons, and gratitude is the right response. The donor said they wanted to make sure their gift went to the right place. Their initial vision aside, the right place might not be a named program or a polished line item. It's an institution healthy enough to still be standing when that donor's grandchildren are old enough to enroll. Schools that can hold that conversation transparently have every chance of becoming that institution. First, you have to have that tough conversation to address whether the school can keep carrying the model that it inherited and what its community can sustainably pay for over the next decade. You also have to address what the alternative organisms competing for the same niche are doing differently, and whether the school knows the carrying capacity of its environment well enough to live within it. Next time on The School Doctor, we dig into the ancestry of the school model and how it shapes the way schools handle money. Episode 6 examines why K-12 schools have modeled themselves on higher education and why that inheritance turns out to be a costly fiscal mistake. That's The Imitation Game, coming soon. If your school is working through questions about long-term sustainability or how to diversify revenue beyond tuition dependence, Educational Vitality Partners offers diagnostic consultations. Think of it as a partner for your institution's growth. Visit edvitality.org to learn more. I'm John D'Adamo, and this has been The School Doctor. Thanks for making rounds with me.